Education Committee meeting. I'm going to start by welcoming someone that's not been with us for quite a while. I know he's missed us, but he's been watching virtually. But Bill, stand up. We're glad to have you here. Yep. As you know, he is not a first-time listener, but he's been attending our meetings for a long, long time, and he had an emergency health issue that came up, and he's tended to that. And I assume you have doctor's permission to be here? We don't want that blood pressure to rise any at all. Okay, we're glad to have you here. Committee, before we jump into hearing on Senate Bill 528, because we are still waiting for Senator Tyson to get here, let's go ahead and let's start with our conversation about Senate Bill 455. Because we did have, it was an assignment, but we had two volunteers. We had Senator Dietrich and Senator Erickson that said, yes, we will take this on and help us move a little bit forward on Senate Bill 455. So why don't you, if you don't mind, Senator Dietrich, just share with us what you've been working on, and we'll kind of move forward.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd be happy to give you some highlights here. So we were looking at ways that we could make this a little less cumbersome on the enrollment and transfer process. So some of the key points that I've asked our revisor to consider is that, first of all, we know that every school district in Kansas probably needs to have and should have a published transfer policy. So we know that KSB has one that districts may or may not adopt, and maybe some districts have their own policies, but the first requirement would be that every school district, all public school districts in Kansas, have a published student interdistrict transfer policy. Secondly, in keeping with the general premise of this original Senate Bill 455, I would ask that any child of school age per Kansas statute, which means you have to be 5 on or before August 31st, may attend a public school in a district where he or she does not reside, provided that that receiving district has capacity. And we talked about capacity last week. And I would share with you that I think capacity is probably best determined by pupil-teacher ratio in each grade level K through 8. And then looking at the secondary level, 9 through 12, that it would be determined by either pupil-teacher ratio or program capacity. Because you remember folks asked about what if I wanted to go into an IB program in another district, because my district didn't have that. And it would help with some of that accessibility and equity issue. Then the next piece, we were talking about dates and the process. So not later than May 1st of every school year, the school board would determine the capacity of each school in the district, of each building in the district, for that following academic year. So that would be by May 1. The number of students expected to attend each school in the district in the following academic year, that would be part of that capacity piece, and the number of additional seats that would be available for non-resident students. And most likely that would be by grade level, I would think, and building, classrooms within buildings. Sure.
Let me just interject that that building assessment that they'll be using for the budgetary purposes dovetails absolutely with us.
Good point, yes, thank you. And then by June 1, then each school district will publish on its website the number of additional seats available by grade level and in each building. Now, that doesn't mean that every district's going to have capacity, because really some growing districts may not in every grade level in every building, and some smaller districts may not. But if you have the capacity, you need to publish that on your website by June 1. Then students and families need to make an application to attend school in the district and in the building that they want to attend in between June 1 and July 1, because you're ready to gear up with staffing and classroom assignments. So that process would be, again, between June 1 and July 1, the non-resident student would make application to the district that they wanted to attend, if space is available. So then school districts need to develop an application form. Completed form should be given to the clerk of the board. Every district has one by June 30th. And if the number of non-resident students that are applying are more than the spaces available, that's when that random lottery process would kick into place, where either the clerk of the board or the superintendent would take the application. Again, there would be no identifying information on that other than the grade level and building, and then through a random lottery process determine who would be attending. And by doing it that way, you don't really need an appeal process because there's nothing subjective about it. Either you have the space or you don't, and that grade level in that building, or you don't. And so there would be no reason for an appeal unless you wanted to touch base with the board. We did put a component in there that, well, first of all, the selection would be completed by July 15th. That gives everybody a chance to get their classroom assignments ready. And then if a transfer request is not accepted, again, for capacity reasons, then they would be able to certainly have a conversation with the board within 10 days if they wanted clarification on the process. So, and I talked through all the discrimination piece, that same language that we had in the other original bill. And the one thing that we talked about last week that I included in this is that any child accepted to attend school out of district will be allowed to remain until they graduate, as long as they're still a student in good standing. So a student not in good standing would be somebody with excessive absenteeism or suspensions, expulsions, those kinds of things. Not limited necessarily to that, but that's the general idea. And any sibling of a student already enrolled in the receiving district gets first priority for spaces available. Transportation, I just said, much like the language, I just kept it simpler in this bill, is that school districts aren't required to provide transportation, but students can certainly be given a bus stop and dropped off at that bus stop if there's space available on that bus to take the bus to school. And then we talked about Acacia and transfer policies, and rather than putting Acacia's policy in this bill, we just said secondary transfer students are subject to Acacia policy requirements in order to participate in Acacia-approved or sanctioned activities in athletics. And then other than that, I just had some questions for Tamara about some language that was in there about contracting between districts. But that's the genesis of the changes and what that would look like, still keeping to the same general intent.
Okay. I think that we're going to just take a little pause right now, give you guys a little bit of time to think about some of those. And I think we'll have time before we end today to kind of revisit it. I think we did hear from Acacia. If you are out of district, it is a 1-year period where you're ineligible, is what we learned. But let's go ahead and let's move to, because we do have the senator here, and I know she has someplace else to be after she testifies. So let's go ahead and start with our hearing on Senate Bill 528, which is requiring school districts to provide reimbursement to teachers for classroom supplies. And so we'll start with a brief overview from our reviser. Tamara, thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and good afternoon, committee. Senate Bill 528 would, as the chair said, require the Board of Education of each school district to provide a reimbursement to teachers for classroom supplies of up to $250 each year. Reimbursements would only be provided for documented purchases of classroom supplies. As used in the bill, the term classroom supplies is defined, and it means any item that may be used in providing education services and is intended to be fully used within the current school year. It does not include food products, beverages, or any equipment or other property that is intended for use over multiple years. The bill would take effect upon publication in the statute book, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Committee, do you have any questions for our reviser? Seeing none, we are ready to get right to testimony. So first up, for proponent, we have Senator Karen Tyson, District 12. Welcome to the Senate Education Committee.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My apologies for being late. Had a conflict with rules and regulations, and it was a prime example why we need a constitutional amendment. Government overreach. Thank you again for your indulgence, and I want to thank this committee for your consideration of Senate Bill 528 and all of the work that this committee does in order to make our schools the best they can possibly be. When I've been visiting with teachers throughout the years, family members, friends, and others, and I would always hear the same thing over and over again. We are paying out of pocket for our school supplies. I know you guys have heard this. If you've talked to any teacher, you know that is a fact. Well, you guys know me. I'm not going to sit back and do nothing about it. Instead, I took action and introduced, we have 2 bills this year. One is this one, which would mandate the school to reimburse a minimum of $250. It does not put a maximum amount on. The school could reimburse up to 100% if they wanted to, but this sets a minimum reimbursement of $250 per teacher in the classroom. The other bill was a tax credit in order to help teachers out. It was a tax credit for school supplies that they would apply for on their income tax up to $250. So total amount, if we pass both pieces of legislation, we would be getting at least $500 reimbursement back to the teachers for their support and all they do in the classroom. I did put in my testimony some facts that you might find interesting. According to the Kansas Department of Education financial report, we will exceed $9 billion for K through 12 funding. $9 billion for 286 school districts. That's approximately $19,487 per student. If we look at the cash reserves, last year it was approximately $36 million in cash reserve. This year, it's estimated to be $42 million in cash reserve. Why are we not getting that money into the classroom, to the teachers where we need to? We shouldn't have to do this through legislation, but yet here we are. I'm asking for your support in Senate Bill 528, and I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Senator, we'll go ahead and ask those questions now so that you can go on to your next meeting.
Thank you.
So committee, what questions? We'll start with Senator Petty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
It's okay.
Not Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Tyson, for being here. I do want you to know that in this bill, it does say the amount not to exceed $250.
Well, then I would ask for an amendment.
So I'm just wanting to share with you that your testimony doesn't match the bill.
Thank you, Senator. And the bill came about this summer. I told one of my nieces, I said, I am so tired of hearing about this and nothing happening on this topic. So this bill and the other bill, the intent is to move the conversation forward.
Senator Erickson, and then Senator Suellentrop.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Senator, for being here in your testimony. Just a quick question on when you have the cash reserve number, that's not the unencumbered cash balance.
No,
I just want to make sure there's a distinction between.
This is the cash reserve that was reported on cash balances by the KDHE on one of their K through 12 reports, school funding reports.
Because I do know the unencumbered cash balances is much, much higher than that. So
I think that's in the hundreds of millions of dollars, if I am correct. Yes.
yes, so thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Senator, for being here. Having taught in the classroom, I can remember all the things that I bought for my classroom. Finally, they instituted where you could bring something up and recommend and tell why you felt like this would be a good purchase for the classroom, like some low-level yet high-interest reading material for sixth graders at a second grade reading level. And I think it's unfortunate that we had to go through all these hoops to try to get these things. And I'm going to be asking the opponents if something like that is in place today. So you're thinking that this is best done at the school board level as opposed to the building level, is that right?
Whatever the committee would entertain, I would be glad to get movement on this legislation, just so that we can show support for our teachers. You know, so many of people are talking about it, but they're not doing anything. Let's actually take action and get some results for those teachers.
Finally, if I may, Madam Chair, and that is, teachers that I've spoken with have said it's hard for them to understand all the dollars that are coming into the district. And oftentimes, and I'm not disparaging decisions that were made, but it appears to them that there's yet another a department head, a superintendent of whatever, and they would rather see more of this money funnel down through the classroom. Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Senator Solentrop, then followed by Senator Sykes and Senator O'Shea.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator, you indicated there's a couple bills passed, or at least one, Senate Bill 282, that had some tax credits in it. Do you know
Yes.
what was totaled?
The total was, I don't remember the fiscal note on it, but I do know the complete bill, that the portion for the teachers was a $250 tax credit on it. And if I remember, the fiscal note was minimal on that. I'm not sure how high it was, but in proportion to the rest of the bill, it was a very small number, but I can get those to you, Senator.
I have it, I just didn't know if you.
I thought you did, and off the top of my head, I don't.
No, it is. It's a minimal amount. Total amount for the entire bill, I think it was 10 million, but the teacher tax credit is minimal. Thank you.
Senator Sykes.
Thank you for being here. My question is in the language of the bill, so it can't be used for anything over a process of a couple of years. It's just for that 1 year. And I guess my question is why? Because I think there are some supplies that are good investment in the classrooms that could be used and then over a couple of years.
Okay, I would leave that to, if I may, Madam Chairman, if I would leave that to the discretion of the committee, and especially since there's a few teachers in the room. It was just a baseline to start, and we had used language that we had seen in other places.
Okay, and my follow-up question is, based on other pieces of legislation that we're looking at this and making sure that parents have access to transparency, is there any talk about making sure that these classroom supplies are, is there any, I guess, vetting process? Or is it anything that the teacher would choose to spend her money on, or his money on?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. There is not a vetting process for this other than the school board and the superintendent. When they turn their receipts in, that would be the vetting process. And they would be taking a second set of eyes at it. And I'll tell you, my husband and I, we usually don't tell this, but we do donate money so that teachers can buy books and other materials for their classroom. And it's disappointing that we are in that mode, that the teachers have to even ask for that kind of donation.
And I agree. I bought, I think, 20 little wobble seats for a kindergarten class so that the kids can wiggle without remaining in their seats. So thank you.
We may need some of those on the Senate floor. Just saying. Senator O'Shea.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was going to say the same thing. Can you give me an example of just some of the supplies that this might include?
A couple of the teachers that I know like to buy materials for their bulletin boards. They have, and they want it to be custom for the class that's coming in that year. And so they would like to be able to purchase those. I know some are purchasing Kleenexes and pencils and pens and other material. I mean, like I said, books, reading books. It's, the supply is endless as to what, I know one science teacher is literally purchasing, she purchases the items that owls, it's pretty gross, but for biology, pellets, thank you. You guys know what so that they can dissect. But, you know, it's a good classroom experience, and she feels like it's important, and she can't get that money or resource for her classroom. So I just think we need to, our teachers, for some reason, they feel like they're not respected or second-class citizens of Kansas, and that is not true. They have more impact on our lives than almost any other person that we interact with, besides family members and friends.
I think the data out there is that a classroom teacher, particularly for elementary kids, will spend more time waking hours with a child than the parents during a school year. So they certainly have tremendous influence. Senator Straub, did you have a question? Okay. Did I miss anyone? Thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Next up, for proponent, we have Mike O'Neill, Kansas Policy Institute. Welcome back to the committee.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mike O'Neill on behalf of the Kansas Policy Institute. I hope everybody's had a chance to peruse the attachments to my testimony today. We stand in tepid support of this particular bill, and I need to explain myself and refocus our attention on what got us here. Keep in mind, going back to the requirement that we have a building-based needs assessment. That needs assessment at the beginning of the year needs to take into account all the things that a teacher will need in the classroom. And that includes the supplies that the teacher will need. That's not to say that that's the cutoff point, because there may be things that arise during the course of the year that would require supplies. But in that regard, I'll again call your attention to the accounting handbook for unified school districts put out by the Kansas Department of Education. On pages 59 through 75 is an exhaustive list of equipment and supplies that a school may and does purchase. These supplies are supplies in large part that are used in the classroom. I don't know when it started or why it started that there was ever a time that a teacher would have to pay for any of these listed supplies out of their own pocket. And yet we see that. I remember when I was in the legislature having a conversation with the school superintendent, a member of the board of a school board, and a local teacher. And the only thing the teacher wanted to talk about to me that day was, well, she didn't really want to talk. She wanted to just show me the receipts for the things that she had purchased. My response was, yes, I hear that a lot. Have you, by any chance, turned those receipts in for reimbursement to the school? And her response, and I'll paraphrase, it's been a while, was, well, we really don't get into the financial side of things. The conversation I was having with the superintendent that day is how they were going to spend down some of their unencumbered cash balances, because at that time they had more than enough money. JG is smiling because he's been down this road with me. They have more than enough to reimburse the teachers, number one, but more importantly, they had enough money to buy those supplies in the first place. Those teachers shouldn't have to be going to their local discount store. They should be going to their supply room. And if those items aren't in the supply room, they need to inform whoever the purchasing agent is to get those supplies for them. So if this bill moves forward, I would suggest that in the rare event that a teacher would need to buy those supplies out of his or her own pocket, they ought to be 100% reimbursable, because it's 100% the responsibility of the school district to pay for those supplies and make sure they're available for the classroom in the first place. It's a part of their needs assessment. Incidentally, I was trying to do some quick looking. Seats are on the list. Let's see, books are on the list. What else was mentioned? Everything that members of the committee have already mentioned. I didn't look at that one. Yes, I did remember hearing that. I didn't get a chance to look at that. It's a non-existent. I said it's an exhaustive list, but it's not an exclusive list. And so there is actually a definition of supplies right there in the accounting handbook. A supply item is an article of material which meets any one of the following conditions. It's consumed, it loses its original shape or appearance with use, it's expendable, that is, if the article is damaged or some parts are lost or worn out, it usually is more feasible to replace it. It's an inexpensive item having characteristics of equipment whose small unit cost makes it inadvisable to capitalize the item. And these are all, it's in there because this is how schools account for those expenditures. But it is fully contemplated that the district will be buying all of these supplies. And the teacher, if they just make those needs known, that ought to be in the supply room, not the discount store. With that, I'd be happy to stand for questions. By the way, the fiscal note in the first year of the $250 tax credit is over $20 million. In the out year, it's $10 million, like 10.4. Very expensive. You've already paid for those supplies with your appropriations. And so I would suggest respectfully to the senator that tax credit is not necessary. Shouldn't be necessary. Thank you.
Any questions? We'll start with Senator Straub.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mike. Some of the things I can think of that teachers used when I was in the classroom were like a chicken egg incubator or an aquarium for different science lessons, or a globe or a certain map for history or geography. Would those kind of things be excluded from this because they're usable from year to year?
Maybe from the bill, because they might, under financial accounting rules, be equipment versus supplies. But again, if it's part of the lesson plan for the teacher, that this is something I need for my class, it's covered. It's equipment or supplies. The bill, of course, I think is limited to supplies, but the point I'm making is the school district is responsible for the reasonable and necessary equipment and supplies needed for the teachers to perform their work in the classroom. And that should be an expense item of the school. To the extent, for some reason, the teacher is required to go get the aquarium on their own, they should be fully reimbursed, not without a limit on that, as long as it's an approved item.
Did you have a follow-up? Okay, Senator Sykes.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, Mike. Have you done any conversations with teachers? Because I know a lot of them are kind of for students in their classroom who maybe do not have the funds to get those pencils and crayons or things like that. Do you have any idea what teachers are spending, like because of that, versus buying the globe or the incubator or things like that?
Not specifically, but one of the first things I noticed about the bill is I think, and I don't know where I got this information, so I can't provide you a link, that the average that teachers are reported as spending is over $250. So this would, if those statistics are correct, it would not fully reimburse them. And again, that's sad. I think it's unnecessary, but I'm sorry I don't have more specific information.
Yeah, I was just questioning because when I get my kids' school supply list, I can easily spend $250 at Target for the watercolors and the crayons. They don't have crayons.
That number's low, and I think if you move forward with something like this, it actually codifies something, I still think it ought to be 100% reimbursement.
Senator Solentrop.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mike, earlier from Senator Tyson, we heard perhaps a dollar amount of reserves that the schools have. Did you hear her mention the amount, millions? Would any of those reserves be precluded from reimbursing these expenses? So there's no restriction or restraint or anything of that nature to simply provide this reimbursement?
There's not. Every district is going to have a different balance, but the balances that I've seen system-wide are more than enough to compensate for that. And again, they have more than enough money in the first place to get the supplies in the first place to meet those needs without them having to be purchased off-site. And it probably can be purchased at a cheaper cost point than the teachers going out even to discount stores.
Committee, any other questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We now move to opponent testimony. We'll start with Mark Tallman, Associate Executive Director, Kansas Association of School Boards. Welcome back, Mark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Blue. I thought it switched. Well, it's green, I guess now. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I guess I'm going to copy a little bit from the previous speaker, who I think said he was a tepid supporter, and perhaps we would express ourselves as a tepid opponent, because we are certainly not opposed to the idea of teachers getting reimbursed for necessary supplies whatsoever. However, in discussing with our leadership, with our staff, with other organizations, we're not aware of any district that doesn't provide some type of supplies or opportunity for reimbursement. It may exist, and that certainly should not be the case to require anyone, teacher or otherwise, to buy things on their own and not be reimbursed. We would not be supportive of that. What we have heard is that it is very common. In fact, the most common dollar amount I heard was to say most districts provide money at the building level for supplies which teachers can draw on. We think a big reason that you may hear concerns from teachers that are not being reimbursed is because I think teachers are very generous people who often want to go well beyond that. So when we look at this bill, our belief is that for the most part, and again, there will certainly be the possibility of exceptions to this, districts are putting an amount out there. And I think what you tend to hear is that most teachers who report this say they spend more than that and would continue to do so. So the question is the district going to reimburse this amount or provide this amount up front? Likewise, I think you just heard from Mr. O'Neill. Many districts will put supplies available in a building area or encourage these purchases to be made in a cost-effective manner. Some teachers may not want to do that. They may want to, they may have something they want to do for their room. They may want to go beyond that. They have the option to do that. This bill, at least as is now, would still be limited to a particular amount. So at least as the bill is now, we don't see this making a big difference. Again, if there are cases where teachers are not being reimbursed for required supplies, we would certainly not support that. But I did in my testimony want to share with you some additional information that might help, again, just be some context of what we're talking about. The second page, one of the things that when we look at national data is very clear that Kansas deals with, we employ a lot of teachers for the population we have. In fact, when we look at national data, we are above both the regional and well above the national average in how many teachers that we employ. Kansans like small class sizes. They like having that individual effort. We're fairly average compared to the region on like teachers, aides, and paras, and we're really below both the national and regional on all other employees. So one thing to understand is we have a lot of teachers to pay, to compensate, and to provide supplies for relative to our population. Good or bad, that's where we are. On page 3, I show you that same data compared to the states in a region, our surrounding states in the Plains region, where, again, you can see Kansas is third highest of the 9 in teachers per pupil, much lower if you look at total population, about average. Our funding per pupil, however, is right about average for our region. We're right in the middle. We're around what the per pupil average would be. So the fact is we're spreading those dollars, if you will, over more people. And you can see that to some extent on page 4 when I give you the average teacher salaries. I said we were kind of right in the middle in terms of funding per pupil, at least as of 2009. On the high side in terms of number of teachers, that puts us just below median when it comes to teacher salaries here. But I also think it's important to understand the trade-offs we have. I was really surprised a year or two ago to find out that Oklahoma, which has much lower per pupil spending than Kansas or funding, has higher average teacher salaries. And the reason is, at least in part, they have far fewer teachers to spread those dollars over. In fact, I think the estimate was if we had their pupil-teacher ratio, our districts would employ over 6,000 fewer teachers. And then on my last page, I show you this gets to that question we often talk about, the percent of dollars going to instruction. And as the accounting manual that Mr. O'Neill shared with you would indicate, instructional spending is basically what you spend on teacher or para or classroom aide salaries, other compensation, and supplies. According to the most recent data we have, the U.S. average of this expenditure from current operating expenses is about 60.4%. We're a little bit ahead of that. We also spend a higher percentage than all but 2 states in our region. So again, just want to give you context that all of these choices are budget trade-offs. And finally, a little talk about reserves. You know, this is something we talk about all the time. I think, you know, recently an audit was done on this that pointed out, although there's a lot of interest in reserves, we've never defined what the right level of reserves should be. The data I've looked at in the past has indicated that our operating reserves, our non-restricted reserves, as a percent of our budget, has stayed fairly pretty constant over the last several years. The dollar amount has gone up, so has our budget. But again, neither the legislature or the state board has really said, well, what's the right level to be at? And I think, perhaps unsurprisingly, districts make a lot of different choices as to what that should be. So, thank you. I'd be happy to take questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you very much. Last up, we have, let me pull this out. We have Lauren Tice Miller, Director of Government Relations and Elections, Kansas National Education Association. Welcome.
Thank you for having me today. Chairwoman Baumgardner, members of the committee, very thankful to have this opportunity to testify, even though it is in opposition to Senate Bill 528. I do want to say that we are thankful that this committee is recognizing the dynamic of teachers using their hard-earned money to supplement their classroom needs has become far too routine, and it is often expected. We actually have cited a recent national study that's found that teachers spend an average of $459 out of pocket each year for classroom and student needs, and Kansas teachers are not an exception. But they tend to invest in items that can be used for many years, or they purchase items such as food or clothing or hygiene items to help their students. And unfortunately, this bill would not allow for the reimbursement of those items. If you look at line 16 in the bill, where it defines classroom supplies, it cannot be used for food or any equipment or other property that is intended for use over multiple years. So unfortunately, those items would still have to come out of pocket. I want to say that Kansas NEA is not opposed to funds being provided to cover the costs of classroom supplies. In fact, we welcome it. However, we do oppose Senate Bill 258 because we believe it creates a situation of robbing Peter to pay Peter. With this bill, it would mandate that school districts would have to set aside a portion of existing general fund dollars to then be used to reimburse teachers for up to $250 for classroom supplies. So this is the same pool of money that would otherwise be used for salaries or benefits. So rather than giving this money to our teachers in the form of a pay increase or to offset the rising costs of healthcare, this bill withholds the money to be used for a limited amount. It was our thought in discussions with some of our members and internally with our leadership that if the legislature truly wants to help educators for out-of-pocket expenses, then it should appropriate the estimated $10 million, which was determined by approximately 44,000 teachers in the state, times the $250, and earmark it specifically to provide the teachers with a legitimate reimbursement with clear and reasonable rules for how to access that. Again, we thank the committee for the consideration on this matter and bringing light to it. It is a very important issue to our teachers, but we do ask you to oppose this bill, and I would stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you very much. Committee, do you have questions for either Mr. Tallman or Ms. Miller? All right. We have lots of questions. We'll start with Senator Sykes, then Gossage, and then Petty. Do you have questions? Okay.
Okay, I think this is for Lauren. Sorry, you just sat down. As legislators, we're working with a finite amount of money and how we do that. And where you mentioned that the average teacher spends $459. So, and and this would be your opinion, but there's a lot of options that we have on the table and bills that I think probably making it harder for some people who are lower income being able, which I would think a lot of those teachers are spending their money to help poor children in their classroom. But do you think, and I know you're in opposition, but I mean, with other bills that we have available, like reducing sales tax on food, that would be an overall for everyone in Kansas, and I mean, closer to $500 per family as opposed to $250. Would you comment on maybe some of those other things, or how legislation that we're addressing could actually be probably causing more of a problem for teachers to have to pull money out of their pockets?
Sure. I will note that I believe it was Senate Bill 520, which then I think was added to Senate Bill 282. 520 was the bill that creates the $250 tax credit. We did offer testimony in support of that because we do believe that that would be helpful to our teachers. So there are other elements. I believe there was a bill late last week in Senate Public Health and Welfare that would restrict access to assistance. And anytime we see things like that, we always hear stories from our teachers that they end up having to spend more because the families simply don't have the funds to maybe be able to provide for that school supply list. And so they're making up for that difference. Or maybe they came to school and they didn't have appropriate clothing. And so the teacher usually pulls out of their pocket to help with that, meet that student need. And so ultimately, we are in, and we have also submitted testimony supporting the sales tax on food because it ultimately helps Kansas families, it helps our teachers, and the overall learning environment. Thank you.
Senator Gossage and then Senator Petty.
Thank you. My question is for Mark. Thank you. In the testimony that we received from Senator Tyson, she mentioned the $36 million in cash reserves, yet we're hearing about certain dollars that we have robbing Peter to pay Peter, et cetera. Could not those dollars be used for that purpose?
Certainly, if a board decides that they want to pull down their reserves to a certain level, they could do so. Now, understand, like as you well know from the state, when you spend reserve dollars, you can only spend them once on the way down. So if you were going to say we're going to use this as a strategy to reduce reserves, that could be done to a point. If you look at the reserve issue, I think what you will find is there is a wide difference between districts, some of which have relatively small, some of which are much higher, based on a lot of different factors. So if in fact this came, if this was adopted as it is, certainly reserves could be used. Again, my point, however you want to take it, is at least what we've heard anecdotally is that districts already have supply budget for districts, in many cases could probably cover this. So I guess that's our point. We don't think this alone would change spending very much. We don't think you'd probably need to go to reserves. We just want you to be aware that to the extent that is the case, the teacher may not be getting more, instead of getting it by going to the supply room, they may be getting it as a reimbursement. That's the only point we're trying to make. But would use of reserves be an option? It would depend on the circumstance of the district. In some cases, it certainly could be.
Mark, I think it would be very helpful to this committee if you said there are already these things in place. You may recall my original question was, are there not? So I would really like to see what sort of how many districts have a reimbursement, what sort of reimbursement is that already for the teachers, because we wouldn't want to duplicate that's something that is already out there, but you understand there are not many details to what you're saying.
I do understand that, and one of the limitations we have is, and I think anyone would say this, we only survey our districts to some point. We don't ask for details of all of their policies, so while we could try to get this information, that's why I'm being honest with you. I'm talking kind of anecdotally what we hear. I believe, and again, not being an expert, the issue of reimbursement could also be a negotiable item between boards and teachers if that's something they want to do. I really think some of what you're hearing today, though, really shows, and I'll go back to saying this, I think teachers are very generous. I think that if they see they want to buy something for a child or they want to do something more special for their room, the cost doesn't hold them back, and then understandably, they can be kind of frustrated, or speaking as a one-time husband of a teacher, you can get some pushback on that generosity at some point when it's out there. But I think we're just trying to say, as this stands right now, we're not sure it would make a significant difference, and we're not trying to minimize the fact that, yeah, everyone continues to hear these costs. It is an issue, but there's a lot of reasons behind it, we believe. So.
And I would just like, if I may, Madam Chair, to conclude with, as a classroom teacher that taught in an area of rather low-income children, apartments, et cetera, not to say everybody in an apartment is low income, but I set up a relationship with the local Salvation Army to find out if there were children who needed to have the free school bag, the materials that they offered. Most of the things that I bought for my classroom was just to make the classroom more interesting, a more exciting bulletin board, a more exciting learning center, et cetera. And I guess I didn't see that as generous. I just saw that as a teacher for children to learn. Those are the types of things that you want to do in your classroom. Thank you, and I appreciate your information and would welcome any of the school districts to get back to us on what they're doing currently with reimbursement. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. Senator Petty, followed by Senator Dietrich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mark, this is for you. This is kind of, you talked about reserves that school districts have. And you were talking about, or you mentioned that there's not one issue or one standard that all school districts follow. It seems like, though, one of the things I've heard repeatedly about is having enough money in reserves to cover monthly costs. So would that be a standard that most school districts have?
Well, what I would say is this. Several years ago, those of you that might remember the, I guess, was it called the efficiency study? I'm looking to see if Senator Winthrop remembers, that looked at that issue. And in developing that, one of the things that they referred to was a Government Finance Officer Association recommendation that I believe suggested that in kind of a normal period of financial risk, which when are we ever in that, a guideline might be something like 50%, or I'm sorry, 15%, something around like 2 months worth of payment. And my recollection, and I should have looked at this more closely for this hearing, I apologize, is that if you look at school district operating reserves, in other words, those that could be brought back in that weren't for like bond issues or capital outlay or those things, the state average, we have been around 10 or 12% of operating budgets as a percent for several years. Most of the growth has been in more restricted areas. But I'm the first to say, you may have some districts that are at 2%, and you may have some districts that are at 25%. That's just a state average. There is a lot of variation around that. And I can't tell you all the reasons why, but that's the point I'm making. I think when you look at reserves, some of the growth has been ordinary growth you would assume if budgets are rising and reserves should be based on that. That's not surprising. But there is a great deal of variation among districts on what their local practice is.
Thank you. And lastly, this really isn't a question for you, but I thought that maybe the State Board of Education might be able to provide us with information. I am aware that a number of school districts actually, when it comes to classroom supplies or individual student supplies, that they're provided by the school districts. And so I don't know, you wouldn't necessarily have that, but the State Board of Education might have that by school districts.
The districts that directly provide supplies?
To K-12. I mean, it mostly be elementary to K-6 probably.
You mean that the teacher can go to like in the building to get their supplies, is that, or?
Actually, that's, yeah, they provide, you know, all the paper, crayons, pencils, all that.
Well, again, our discussion internally from people who've been administrators and superintendents is to say it's common that a building will have supplies available, but they will not necessarily cover everything that the teacher wants to do. Senator Gossett says to be more, to go beyond that, to be more interesting, to make a better learning center. So there's, if you will, kind of maybe a foundation provided is common, but it will not necessarily cover everything the teacher wants to do.
Senator Dietrich.
Thank you. Not to belabor this, but usually school districts, and it's been my experience, they have a budgeting process that allows them to give dollars to classrooms and buildings and departments. We did it like kindergarten students. You need more supplies in a kindergarten classroom than you do in a 7th grade classroom. So we would do a per pupil dollar amount. I think it was like, when I retired, it was like $47 per kindergarten student. So that teacher would have almost $1,000 if they had 20 kindergartners to purchase supplies. So you do have general supplies in every building that teachers can access, pencils and crayons and glue. The pushback sometimes comes with the teacher who wants to have all colored folders and the supply closet has manila folders. Or they want to have a glue stick for every student rather than a box of glue sticks, so you don't want them eating the glue sticks is my point. So that's kind of the pushback that you get occasionally, but it's been my experience that we do spend, I mean, as a teacher even, you spend money on things that you want that the school doesn't supply, but the supply dollars are there. It's just how it's distributed among districts is different. Like at the high school level, it goes to the department determines how they, in most districts, how they spend those dollars with their teachers. So the building needs assessment that we were talking about earlier, I mean, this is a perfect discussion point. I'm not sure the State Board of Education will have the information you're looking for. I was thinking KSDE does, but Craig is shaking his head no, so I won't go there. But I think, it varies among districts how you allocate those dollars, but everybody gets allocated dollars, I would say, with confidence. Not even tepid, with confidence.
That would be our understanding. But again, we haven't surveyed everyone. There certainly may be exceptions that you hear about.
Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mark, you will be probably happy to know that my question is for Lauren. But first, Madam Chair, I would like to make a comment because I'm hearing a lot of discussion around teachers maybe want something different, and it's a want, not a need. I taught at a time, it's been longer than I care to acknowledge, but I would dare say it's probably not unusual. I taught in a high school in a business education department before there was a lot of technology, including online accounting courses. And we had no paper, no copy paper, none at the beginning of the school year. We were told that was cut. That's not a want. That was a need. At the same time, the district was paying for administrator cell phones. And I could go on and on and on. And the choice was made at the local level, is it not, as to what funds get spent where. So the local Board of Education had to decide administrator cell phones were more important than paper at the building level. So I just don't want us to lose track of it happens where it's not a want, it is a need, and because priorities don't always happen at the classroom level, that's where I think a lot of the disconnect comes in. So I just want to point that out. My question for you, Lauren, is in your testimony, you say Kansas NEA is not opposed to funds being provided to cover the cost of classroom supplies to offset what teachers traditionally pay out of pocket. In fact, we welcome it. On down further, appropriate, they estimate $10 million and earmark it to provide teachers with legitimate reimbursement. Your final paragraph, we agree with the committee that the dynamic of teachers using their hard-earned money to supplement their classroom needs has become far too routine and at times even expected. Your solution is for the legislature to give you more money. Do you have any other solutions that you can speak to? Thank you, Madam Chair.
So when speaking specifically to this bill, the concern that we have is that it takes money out of the same pot that would otherwise go towards teacher salaries or teacher benefits. And as we've heard, districts already have some reimbursement, although a number of our teachers mentioned they weren't aware of that. So I think we have some other work to do with that. But specifically with this, rather than taking it, having it mandated and only very limited, because with this one, with the way it is written, is it's limited to like paper or glue sticks or markers and things like that. But as we've discussed, teachers pay out of pocket for far more items than that. And even the books that were mentioned earlier, bulletin board, decorations, all of that, none of that would come out of this. And so if we truly want to address all the full scope of what teachers pay out of pocket, which we note is actually up to more like $459 a year, then there needs to be something, rather than the legislature tell local school boards how to spend the general fund monies that they have, why not allocate the extra amount to create a fund specifically earmarked for supplies that could even potentially do what Senator Tyson mentioned in her testimony of don't cap it at $250 and allow it to pay for these additional items that teachers pay out of pocket for.
Do you have a follow-up?
If I may, I do have a question, if you would allow, Madam Chair, for JG. JG, how much additional funding did school districts get this year due to the Gannon settlement?
Madam Chair, I believe that if we look at the cost consistent with estimated students we have projected for 2023, I believe it was about $102 million.
Thank you, JG. And it seems to me with all of the talk about teachers being unhappy, teachers being stressed out, trying to retain and recruit teachers, taking approximately 10% of the increase of funding isn't too much to ask our school districts to prioritize what students and teachers need. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I will do a quick follow-up. I am curious with regard to KNEA. So as you're walking up, I'll just ask the question. At any time, have you gone before the State Board of Education and requested them to allocate $10 million in any way?
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I haven't been with K&E long enough to know that history, so I would be happy to get that answer for you.
Okay, I think that would be helpful. The other question that I have is, you mentioned line 16 of the bill.
Mm-hmm.
So are you asking to amend that if we were to move forward so that it could include items that, I don't know so much that very few teachers are going to use the same bulletin board year after year. They're going to do something new and different. Some of it's just where you're going to store it for spring of next year. But if you were to include food, clothing, and other items, would you be supportive of that? I see that more as kind of a red herring. We're opposed to this because it limits that, but what we really want is, where's the 10 million? So I'm curious, do you mention that in your third paragraph because legitimately you'd like to see that amended?
I think we would be open to consider that.
Why would you be opposed to considering that?
Because
Why would you be opposed to that being amended, I guess?
Well, I don't know that we would be opposed to amending that portion. I think we would still be opposed to the fact that you're taking money still out of the main general fund that is that should otherwise be, I totally just lost my train of thought. I apologize.
Not taking away from wherever else it might be spent.
Correct. And yeah, exactly.
So we are at the throes of starting negotiations. Can you come to us with any school districts where in actual negotiations, they have negotiated that funds be set aside for teachers to use in the classroom?
Again, that's something else I would have to look up for you, but I would be happy to provide that information for you.
I think that would be helpful, and particularly when I'm looking at the materials that Mr. Tallman presented, where we exceed both regionally and nationally the number of principals and assistant principals, and I assume it's not so much principals, but it's more we exceed with assistant principals. We exceed the ratio of student and staff. We have more staff members, almost 74% compared to the national 62.5 and regional 69.9. So we have more teachers in a classroom with fewer students regionally or nationally. You compound that with 18, almost 19,000 fewer students in these last 2 years. That means that's been post this data. This data is from 2019. So this data is pre-pandemic. So we have even fewer students in the classroom, which means that ratio has increased. It seems as if there should be a way for our school districts to find the means for food to be available. And I'll use one example that we never mention. Every single day in our schools, we talk about food insecurity. Every day in our schools, there is food left over from breakfast and lunch that goes down the disposal. That food could be packaged in some manner and made available for those kids, so our teachers aren't having to buy and supplement food. It's a real easy process. KNEA, Kansas Association of School Boards, and our superintendents have never moved forward to tackle that effort. And I think that as, it gets to the heart of the matter. Why is this bill here? Why was the tax bill in assessment and taxation? It's because we continue to not hear politely from teachers, it would be nice, but we continue to be hammered by teachers that there is no help coming from the legislature for their out-of-pocket expenses. We're certainly not hearing from them. I love teaching in this school district because they give us $250 to spend. But instead, it is why are legislators not in your situation, in your testimony, why aren't legislators just giving us $10 million instead of finding it from within? So I do hope that, we'll see how far the committee wants to work this particular bill, but there are many other issues that have come up today that I think we can find solutions within our own local school districts. So thank you for your testimony. Committee, we are out of time. Our meeting is adjourned.